A couple of weeks ago now, TT Games published a rather controversial set of system requirements for LEGO Batman Legacy of the Dark Knight on PC. This all centered around the use of frame generation. The recommended requirements listed GPUs like an RTX 2070 Super, but this was only supposed to enable an output of 1440p 60fps using medium settings with DLSS quality and frame generation enabled. This implied the base frame rate would be just 30 FPS, completely unacceptable for modern gaming. TT Games also listed a 60 FPS output with quality upscaling and frame generation for the 4K tier, albeit with no guidance on preset. This tier demanded at least an RTX 4070 or RX 9070 XT, which got gamers a bit concerned about how heavy this LEGO Batman title would be. Then, of course, the minimum requirements detailed an absolutely ridiculous 1080p 30fps configuration with balanced upscaling and frame gen enabled using just low settings. A 30fps output with frame gen enabled, of course, means a base frame rate of just 15fps, which is pretty disgusting. I saw lots of online criticism of these specs from gamers blasting optimization, the use of Unreal Engine 5, and all the usual stuff. But as of today, the game is actually available to play. LEGO Batman The Legacy of the Dark Knight launched for Deluxe Edition owners on May 19, ahead of the full release on May 22nd. So this got me thinking, how accurate are these system requirements? Is LEGO Batman a really punishing game to play that has been optimized for frame generation, or is what TT Games listed a load of crap? To explore this, I purchased a copy of the game and paid 140 Australian dollary dues for the Early Access Deluxe Edition, which sounds crazy, but is just a fraction of the total amount I've spent on LEGO products over the years. Rather than thinking too much longer about what that grand total would be, I slotted in one of the recommended GPUs into my test system, the GeForce RTX 2070 Super, which is supposed to be good for 1080p 60fps medium settings with upscaling and frame gen enabled. I played through the game until I found an area that I found was the most demanding in the first couple of hours, that being the first open world area you reach. The city of Gotham is split into multiple areas that you unlock over time, so I guess performance could get worse later on, but for now, I think this first zone is quite representative of the experience that I've played so far, or at least is the most demanding thing that I've found so far. With the RTX 2070 Super installed, I then used the exact listed configuration, so 1440p medium preset, DLSS quality enabled, and then to start with I decided to play without frame generation enabled, just to see what it was like. Much to my surprise, this exact configuration does not run at 30fps on this hardware, in fact far from it. On the 2070 Super, I was getting around 80 to 90 FPS in this open world area for the most part, without enabling frame generation. In the most intensive moments, the frame rate dipped into the high 70s, but this is absolutely not a GPU that, using medium settings at 1080p with upscaling, would require the use of frame generation as well. Another GPU that is listed in the recommended tier is the Radeon RX 6650 XT, which I happen to own. So I slotted that GPU in, again, set the game to the medium preset at 1440p with FSR quality upscaling, and the story was basically the same as on the RTX 2070 Super. A decent frame rate with this configuration, hovering in the 80 to 90 FPS range. Far from the sort of 30 FPS base frame rate that would require frame generation to hit 60 FPS, and it's good enough to deliver a highly playable experience, with of course the occasional Unreal Engine traversal stutter. In fact, the RTX 2070 Super can actually run this game using the highest preset, Epic, at 1440p with DLSS quality upscaling enabled. Now, this is not the sort of configuration I'd recommend, as the frame rate is only in the 40s, and there's more hitching than using lower settings, as Epic tends to be a lot more memory intensive, and this is only an 8GB GPU. But even in the most intensive moments, I was still getting above 35 FPS using Epic as opposed to medium. Then, of course, from here we can enable frame generation, FSR frame generation on the 2070 Super, as NVIDIA doesn't support the DLSS version on the 20 series, and this takes the 1440p Epic experience to a little bit above 60 FPS. However, VRAM is a bit of an issue here, with the game regularly trying to use more than 8GB, which causes more hitching and stuttering than using lower settings, so again, it's not really something I'd recommend. The RX 6650 XT is much less capable of using the Epic preset and is clearly crippled by VRAM in some areas. I was getting performance up around 40 FPS at times, but in more intensive areas, this would dip into the teens, which is obviously not a great experience. So on this GPU, I'm much more likely to recommend the medium preset at 1440p, which is actually quite playable using native TAA rendering without any FSR upscaling enabled. Certainly not what TT Games suggested would be possible on this class of GPU. Another thing I noticed when using the 2070 Super and 6650 XT is that system memory usage would regularly exceed 16 gigabytes. My test system has 32 gig of DRAM, and the system requirements call for only 16 gig, at least for the recommended spec. So are the performance expectations perhaps set for PCs with 8 gig of VRAM and just 16 gigabytes of system memory? Well, not really. I swapped my system to using 16 gig of DRAM and saw no substantial performance change. Now, I am using a Ryzen 7 9800X3D CPU for this testing, whereas the recommended tier suggests either an Intel Core i7-12700 or an AMD Ryzen 7 5800X, much slower processors. I briefly looked at this game on another system that just so happened to have a 5800X in it, and it ran fine. Performance was good at a similar sort of level to what I've been showing here. It doesn't appear to be an overly CPU demanding title, as you might have noticed in the performance overlay, so these tiers of CPU are not going to slaughter performance down to 30 FPS. By using a 9800X3D, I can also safely confirm that when using GPU hardware similar to or faster than an RTX 2070 Super, LEGO Batman runs fine at 1440p using medium settings. This is not a situation where you only get 30 FPS on that tier of GPU hardware, and the developers suggest using FrameGen in an attempt to solve that problem. As I pointed out in my previous videos on this topic, frame generation doesn't solve poor performance, but we don't really have to worry about that here. So what about the 4K tier in the system requirements? To explore this, I slotted in an RTX 4070, which is what they recommend for the GPU, and then cranked the settings up to Epic along with DLSS quality upscaling. Based on the requirements, you'd expect this configuration to run at about 30 FPS, requiring FrameGen to hit a 60 FPS output. But again, that's not the case. The system requirements are not fully indicative of how the game actually runs. In this area, one of the more intense areas of the open world I've found so far, the RTX 4070 was capable of rendering about 45 to 50 FPS on max settings. Now, I wouldn't say this is the smoothest output I've ever seen, but in general, it's a 50 FPS sort of experience, which is well above 30 FPS, and again, I'm not using frame generation here. If you do use FrameGen, the RTX 4070 outputs around 70 to 80 FPS in this area, which is much closer to what is listed in the system requirements than we saw for the recommended GPUs at 1440p medium. The Radeon RX 9070 XT, also listed in the 4K tier, is in a similar position to the RTX 4070, rendering 45 to 50 FPS in the most intensive areas of this open world slice. I'm using Epic settings here with FSR quality upscaling. This does make LEGO Batman a very intensive title to run using the Epic preset. The 9070 XT is a powerful GPU, and we're using quality upscaling while getting a sub 60 FPS output, which is not ideal. The Epic preset on an RX 9070 XT delivers similar native 4K performance, around 30 FPS, to titles like Star Wars Outlaws using the Ultra preset and Cyberpunk 2077 using ray tracing. It's a little easier to run than Borderlands 4 was at launch using the Badass preset. The high settings are less taxing on the 9070 XT at 4K using FSR quality upscaling, with performance sitting comfortably above 60 FPS in this configuration, though upscaling is required as natively the game runs below 60 FPS with the high preset. Then using medium, still FSR quality upscaling, performance is generally around 100 FPS, and personally, I still think the medium preset looks great, though this isn't an in-depth look at visuals or optimization. Of course, the really controversial aspect to these requirements was the minimum tier, which appeared to be advocating for 15 to 30 FPS frame generation on low-end hardware. Unfortunately, I don't own any of the GPUs listed here, so I had to dig into the archives to find something that was in the same ballpark of slowness. Initially, I settled on the Radeon RX 6500 XT, a terrible GPU that is faster than the RX 6400 that's listed, but still really slow and limited to the same 4 GB of VRAM. Again, the listed requirements grossly exaggerate how taxing this game is to run on weaker systems. I configured the game at 1080p using the low preset and FSR balanced upscaling, which is a horrible upscaling configuration for this resolution, but whatever. And then I decided not to use frame generation just to start off with. The 6500 XT here is actually not too bad, though I'd describe performance as all over the place. Even just running around the open world, sometimes performance would be as high as 100 FPS using these settings, but then I'd see dips into the high 40s and low 50s. It seems that while the game tries to fit inside 4GB of VRAM using the low preset, it doesn't really manage to do so very well, so you get performance fluctuations, traversal stutter, and hitching. But no frame generation is required, and certainly not 15 to 30 FPS frame gen. In fact, the game is somewhat playable on the 6500 XT using native 1080p rendering and the low preset. For much of the gameplay I captured, this configuration was actually running over 60 FPS, so LEGO Batman is able to scale across a wide range of hardware. I also tried to run this configuration on the Radeon RX 570, a graphics card which is 9 years old at this point, 10 years old if you factor in how it was a rebranded RX 470. Again, the low settings at 1080p don't require stupid levels of frame generation on this card. I was getting a decent experience considering the age of this hardware with native rendering and no frame gen. This card only really seemed to struggle on the top of this tower when looking out across the open world, perhaps a VRAM limitation given the draw distance, and even still this part ran at 30 FPS there, not 15 FPS, with performance jumping up to a more reasonable level when diving back down to the ground. So that's my quick look into LEGO Batman Legacy of the Dark Knight and how it actually runs on the hardware listed in the controversial PC system requirements chart. Essentially, this is still quite a taxing game to run on the highest settings. There's no doubt about it, this game can be as difficult to run as other major AAA titles with high hardware requirements. But it's not as taxing as TT Games made it appear in their recommended specs. No, those listed configurations do not run at just 30 FPS based on my experience, and they do not need frame generation to achieve 60 FPS. In reality, PC gamers should be able to run this title at 1080p 60 FPS low settings using relatively weak hardware, which bodes well for those with old GPUs or handhelds. If you've got recommended class hardware, so GPUs in the realm of an RTX 2070 Super or RX 6650 XT, you should actually be seeing over 60 FPS without frame gen using the medium preset at 1440p. And then the 4K tier is probably the most accurate for maxed out gaming, but you should still expect higher frame rates than what is listed on RTX 4070 or RX 9070 XT sort of hardware. A lot of the criticism that I saw around these tough requirements was that this is just a LEGO game, which surely shouldn't need an RX 9070 XT to run at 4K 30 FPS. I certainly get where that opinion is coming from because this game is obviously not going for ultra-realistic visuals. A lot of the game's world is clearly simplified, cartoony and basic because it's made out of Lego bricks. But actually playing the game maxed out, I think it looks really great in terms of the lighting with tons of high-quality reflections, shadows and illumination. The lighting in this mode does interact more realistically with the plastic surfaces of the Lego that forms most of the game world and characters. That sort of lighting might not be strictly necessary for a LEGO game, but high-end GPU owners do get some nice eye candy when using the Epic preset. The other thing is that using the Epic preset is totally optional. Performance more than doubled for me, dropping the preset from Epic to Medium, which is only a reduction of 2 presets by the way, and I think the game still looks great using medium settings. Again, I haven't done a deep dive here, but there appears to be a lot of scalability to LEGO Batman, which allows the game to run on a broad range of hardware without looking terrible. Even the low settings are very usable for this style of game in my opinion, while of course not looking as nice as the higher modes. When you factor all of this in, I think TT Games probably shouldn't have released their system requirements as they did. I think it only served to turn people off the game who were disappointed with the apparently high performance cost of running this title. I think if they'd made it a bit clearer how the game scaled and how it would run on that sort of mid to low tier hardware and how much it does scale from the Epic to medium presets, I think you wouldn't have turned off as many people from this particular title. And even just things like omitting the frame generation stuff and the upscaling stuff, because even in some of those configurations, those things aren't required. I think that would have gone a long way to appeasing people and shown the game in a more realistic light, at least based on what I've seen from playing the game so far. That fumble aside, the game itself, it appears to have gotten good reviews and feedback from people in the early access period. I've played a couple of hours now, and my impression is that this seems to be like a kind of Batman Arkham style game, but also a Lego game, which is pretty neat because the Arkham series is one of my personal favorites, and I'm really enjoying how they've blended that with sort of the, I guess, lighter, humorous tone of Lego titles. So I'm definitely going to play more when I get the chance, but Forza Horizon 6 has also been released recently, so there's, a lot of high quality games that I need to sink my teeth into. So anyway, that's it for this brief look at Lego Batman, The Legacy of the Dark Knight. Did want to follow up on this because we did make those videos sort of criticizing the frame generation stuff, so I was keen to check out and just have a look at exactly how the game runs and whether that stuff was accurate. So I think we've done a reasonable job of that for now. And also, because we have got some performance data in here, hopefully you've found this useful if you are thinking of playing this game. You have a bit more of an accurate look at what this game is like to run on a variety of hardware, at least the recommended specs and that sort of thing. It isn't quite as taxing as is listed on those system requirements as we've talked about throughout this video. I'm not sure how much more content we'll do on this game, not sure if we'll be getting into any big GPU benchmarks or optimization guides, but yeah, we'll see how it goes. We'll see what the demand is like for that sort of thing. But for now, I just recommend, the medium to high settings seem to run pretty well in this title, so check those things out. What else is there to say? If you want to support the channel, we've got Patreon, links to those in the description below. You can sign up to get access to the usual benefits and good stuff. But yeah, I'm filming this one pretty late at night, so I'll stop rambling, I'll go to bed, and yeah, I guess I'll catch you in the next one.